Welcome to Whole Health. We're happy you're here on this journey of exploration with us as we learn what it means to live a life dedicated to spiritual, mental, and physical health. Before we begin our program, we want to share a brief legal disclaimer. The information provided on this program, including any health-related advice or discussions, is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making any decisions regarding your health. Now, let's turn it over to Pastor Jeremy, Dr. Creatine, and Brittany Pfeiffer for today's episode of Whole Health.
Welcome back to Whole Health. I'm your host, Jeremy Higgins, and I'm here with my partners in health, Dr. Creatine and Brittany Pfeiffer, our nutrition expert. Listen, if you joined us for our last episode, we spent a lot of time talking about peptides and some of the exciting advancements that are happening in regenerative medicine. We talked about how peptides can support healing, tissue repair, recovery, body composition, even healthy aging. They're one of the newest areas of medicine that have generated a lot of excitement over the past several years, and I'd say understandably so. But as we're wrapping up that conversation, I got to say, I kept coming back to one thought. Before we start talking about optimizing the body, shouldn't we first ask whether we're giving the body what it needs to function well in the first place? Because no matter how advanced medicine becomes, no matter how incredible some of these new therapies are, the body can only work with the materials that it's given. Today's episode is really about those foundations. We're going to spend some time talking about two of the most researched nutritional compounds available today, creatine and protein. Probably mostly creatine today, and the next episode we'll dig deeper into the protein conversation. Now, before anybody hears those words and immediately thinks, this episode isn't for me because I'm not trying to become some kind of big old bodybuilder, I'd encourage you to stick around, stay with us, because honestly, that's one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding these topics. You see, when most people hear the word creatine, they picture somebody in a gym carrying around a big, gallon water jug, mixing neon-colored powders into a shaker bottle, trying to bench press hundreds and hundreds of pounds. When people hear protein, they picture fitness influencers, posing with chicken and rice meals, prepped containers, and all of that all over their social media. I think we're all getting tired of that.
Yeah.
But the reality is that researchers are no longer studying creatine only in athletes. They're studying it in older adults who are trying to maintain independence, and women that are going through perimenopause and menopause, and they're studying its role in cognitive function, sleep deprivation, recovery from concussion, depression, and again, even healthy aging. Likewise, protein isn't just about muscles. Protein is involved in virtually every system of the body. Your immune system, your hormones, neurotransmitters, they all depend on it. Your skin, your hair, connective tissue, enzymes, organs, even the cells that repair your body, they're all relying on adequate protein. So today's not really a conversation about sports nutrition. It's a conversation about health physiology and how the body creates energy, repairs itself, adapts to stress, and age as well. Now, I think this topic is becoming increasingly important because so many people today are simply running on empty. We're asking our bodies to do more than we ever have before. We're sleeping less. Stress levels are higher. A lot of people are under eating quality protein, probably eating a bunch of garbage. That's a whole nother episode. But we're spending more time sitting than we did in previous generations. We're asking our brains to process an incredible amount of information every day. We're expecting our bodies to recover from illness and injury and workouts and pregnancies and surgeries and even the normal just wear and tear of life. And yet we often don't stop to ask whether we actually supply the raw materials needed to support all of those processes. Now, one of the themes that you're going to hear from us, and we're going to come back to it throughout today's conversation, is that health isn't typically built through, dramatic interventions. It's built through consistent investment in the basics. And that's true in nutrition, exercise, sleep, and honestly, it's true in our faith as well. Most of our spiritual growth doesn't happen because of one extraordinary moment. There's typically a moment that, pushes you into that faith journey, but man, it happens because of small, faithful decisions that are repeated over and over again. And the same is often true from our physical health. The simple things that are rarely glamorous, but are often the things that produce the greatest long-term results. So today, we're going to start by talking about creatine, what it actually is, why your body already makes it, why it's become one of the most researched supplements in the world, and why scientists are now looking far beyond muscles into areas like brain health, recovery, metabolism, and yes, healthy aging. And then during our next conversation, we'll dig into protein, why it's so much more than just muscle food, how it supports virtually every system in the body, and how much we actually need. Why so many adults and children are consuming far less in their bodies than they ideally thrive on. So put that on your calendar. It's an important conversation. So, as always, our goal isn't to convince everybody listening that they need another supplement. Our goal is education. We want to help you understand how your body was designed to work so you can make informed decisions about your health. I think almost everyone has heard the word creatine, but let's face it, if you stop somebody on the street and you ask them, hey, what is creatine? Most people are going to really have no idea how to answer that question. Some people think it's a steroid. Other people think it's some kind of stimulant. Some say, it's a pre-workout. So before we talk about benefits, let's just start with the basics. Dr. Kalla, what exactly is creatine?
So creatine isn't a drug. It's not a hormone, steroid, or stimulant. But creatine is actually something your body is designed to make every single day and is utilized every single day. Your liver, kidneys, pancreas, and even your brain produce creatine from 3 amino acids: glycine, arginine, and methionine. It's a completely normal part of human physiology. On top of that, we also obtain creatine naturally from food, particularly animal foods like beef, bison, venison, pork, salmon, tuna, and other fish. So every person listening today already has creatine inside their body. So the question isn't whether you have creatine. The question is whether your tissues have enough to optimally meet the demands you're placing on them. And that's where supplementation enters this conversation. Researchers now consider creatine something that's almost conditionally essential. Your body makes enough, just enough to keep you alive, but it might not make enough to optimize health, recovery, or performance, especially during those periods of increased demanding like aging, illness, injury, intense exercise, sleep deprivation, and chronic stress.
So I actually love that distinction because I think sometimes people hear supplement and assume we're introducing something foreign into the body. But really, we're talking about giving the body more of something it already recognizes and already uses in every single day. It's almost like protein. Your body makes proteins. You eat protein. Sometimes you supplement protein. It's basically the same idea.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why creatine has the strongest safety profiles of any supplement we have. It's been well researched for way more than 30 years, and usually it's in like the bodybuilding when I think
Yeah.
of creatine. And I'll be honest, even in practice, so we're going on year 17 in
Nice.
practice, but I have to admit, I'm kind of ashamed. Even 4 years ago, creatine was not on the top of my mind of
Sure.
something of discussing with patients. But the reason why it's become one of the foundational supplements that I recommend, especially for healthy aging, is because of the protection from sarcopenia and osteopenia. Very, very, very important for both creatine and protein.
Hmm.
So I love it, but there's literally thousands of published studies, and it's one of the most extensively researched nutritional compounds available. Yet, despite all of that research, many people still think of it as something reserved for professional athletes only.
Yeah. I think that it's one of those things that's so misunderstood that conversations like this are absolutely important to get people in that right mindset. When you get into that right thinking process, then you can approach it and use it properly. So let's talk about that process because I think it's really where people start getting lost. Whenever somebody explains creatine, they start talking about ATP. People nod politely as if they understand what that means, and they have absolutely no idea what ATP actually is or what it does. Can you explain ATP in normal human language for the rest of us?
Yeah, so let's imagine your phone. Your phone has a battery. Every time you use it, whether you're making a call, checking email, watching a video, or using GPS, that battery drains.
Mm.
Eventually, you have to recharge it. Our cells work in that same way. Instead of running on electricity, your cell runs on a tiny energy molecule called ATP. The easiest way I tell people on the ATP, think 3 phosphates. That's
Okay.
the triphosphate. ATP is essentially the energy currency of life. Every heartbeat requires ATP. Every
Mm.
breath, every muscle contraction, nerve impulse, thought, immune response, healing process, hormone signal, everything your body does requires this ATP. So the interesting part that your body stores very little ATP. In fact, your body couldn't regenerate ATP. You'd only
Wow.
have enough stored energy to function for a matter of seconds. That's how quickly it's utilized. So your body has developed an incredibly efficient ways of recycling ATP over and over again. It's one of the most And one of the most important systems involves creatine.
So ATP isn't really something we store, it's something that we're constantly making and constantly spending.
Exactly. So creatine stores that phosphate molecule. When ATP gets used, it loses one of those phosphates and becomes ADP. So think diphosphate or 2-phosphate.
Hmm.
Creatine donates its phosphate back to ADP, rapidly converting it back to ATP.
Huh.
That entire process happens almost instantly, and it's one of the fastest energy systems in the body.
So when people hear someone say creatine gives you energy, they're not talking about energy like drinking a cup of coffee.
Yeah, correct. Think cellular energy, and that's a really important distinction. Creatine does not stimulate you. It doesn't raise your heart rate. It doesn't increase your adrenaline. You won't feel creatine the way you'd feel caffeine.
Hmm.
Instead, it improves your ability to regenerate cellular energy. It's supporting the machinery underneath everything in your body that's it's already trying to do.
Right. So that actually makes me think about something we've talked about several times on this program before. Modern life is incredibly demanding. Most people are raising kids, taking care of aging parents, trying to work out, trying to eat healthier, sleeping less than they should, no doubt, constantly responding to emails and text messages. Our brains never really shut off. So it almost sounds like the body is constantly spending ATP.
Yep, spending it, recreating it, and spending it again. So every stressor in our body requires energy, whether that's a physical stress like working out, a mental stress, an emotional stress. It's constantly learning new information. Every digestion requires energy. One researcher described creatine as something that comes to the rescue. Whenever cells are under increased metabolic stress, it's a really helpful way to think about it. When demand increases, cells need more ATP. Creatine helps replenish that energy more quickly. That's why researchers are now studying creatine in situations like sleep deprivation, concussion, recovery, depression, healthy aging, neurologic disease, and even pre and post surgeries, and even jet lag, not just in the weight room.
Wow, jet lag. I could use that for sure. I think this is probably the point where a lot of listeners are starting to realize that we've been talking about creatine for a little while now, and we haven't actually talked very much about lifting weights, which is great because it challenges a misconception that it's been around for, I guess, decades. If you were to stop 10 people in the grocery store and ask them, hey, what is creatine for? I think most of them would say building muscle. But based on what we've talked about so far, that answer feels incomplete. If creatine is really supporting ATP production, if it's really helping the body regenerate energy, then wouldn't any tissue with high energy demands potentially benefit from having more available creatine?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts that's happened in the scientific community over the last like 15 to 20 years, since all this research has just been exploding.
Right.
Originally, all that research was just focused on athletes because that's where people are noticing the benefits, right? So they observed improvements in strength, power output, sprint performance, recovery. So naturally, that's the conversation kind of stayed centered there around sports performance. Interestingly, when you think about the creatine, when you take it, you may not notice it at first. It's not like that first or second rep that it's in your ability to regenerate quickly. So if you're really working out really, really hard and using all your energy stores, you need sufficient rest time in between sets. A lot of people are like, I don't have 2 hours to spend in the gym, right, to hit my goals. So this helps your cells regenerate so much faster, so your rest periods can be less. And so you're going to notice it on like the 4th, the 5th, the 6th reps. It's when you go farther into it that you have more energy, and then that translates over time. So, but that's where the main focus was. But then researchers started asking, like, what does creatine do for muscle? Now they're switching it to what else in the body is energy critically important? Like, what could this be used for? Because your muscles are not the only things that use energy, right? Your brain is constantly consuming energy. Your heart beats over 100,000 times every day without taking a break. Your immune system ramps up every time you're exposed to an infection. Your nervous system is constantly sending signals.
Sure.
Your muscles, are definitely part of this conversation. They repair themselves after every workout. Your liver has to process nutrients and detoxify 24 hours a day. So all those things can require an immense amount of energy. So all of them depend on that ATP. And one of those systems has periods of increased demand. That's why the researchers have kind of switched things up and started to research different areas besides just athletics.
Sure. So that's a really interesting way to think about it because it almost sounds like we've been putting creatine into the wrong category. Instead of asking whether it's a sports supplement, maybe we should be asking whether it's an energy metabolism supplement.
Yeah, I think it's a much better way to describe it. If you look at where creatine is stored in the body, about 95% is in skeletal muscle because muscle is our largest organ and serves as a storage reservoir. But the remaining 5% is incredibly telling. It's stored in the brain, heart, and the nervous system and other tissues that require tremendous amounts of energy. That should immediately tell us something. The body doesn't waste resources. Again, God's perfect design on this amazing machine.
Right.
But if it stores creatine in these tissues, it's because of the tissues depend on it. And here's another interesting point. The benefits of creatine often become more obvious during periods of stress. Researchers sometimes describe creatine as a nutrient that comes to the rescue when energy demands suddenly increase. So if you think about intense exercise, your muscles suddenly need enormous amounts of ATP. If you're recovering from surgery, healing requires tremendous amounts of energy.
Sure.
Same thing with an infection. Your immune system rapidly increases energy production. So our human body is constantly changing. If you want to use the analogy of a car, our efficiency of miles per gallon. And we can think of creatine as a miles per gallon on if I'm going to have a really intense day of working out, my miles per gallon is going to be less efficient compared to a day where I'm not having a lot of physical activity. If I'm sitting in chronic pain, that is physiologically stressful and demanding, even though I'm not having a high physiologic load. And so again, that intensity of energy production dedicated towards one, the brain being aware of pain, that's a signaling. So sleep deprivation, the same thing. Your brain has to work much harder to maintain that cognitive function. So depending on what our day-to-day stressors are, and the other thing too that, we can consider is we live in Iowa. And a phenomenon that's being talked a lot on the political landscape is the amount of cancer rates in Iowa and per capita. And so even our environment, whether it's the air we breathe, the water we're drinking, metabolically, that's going to change our miles per gallon, if you will, of creatine, protein, and some of these other amino acids.
Wow, that's pretty intense. It actually might be one of the biggest takeaways so far, I think. It's not that creatine treats all of these different diseases or conditions, it's that creatine helps support the energy system.
Yeah, so sometimes we get caught up looking for that one supplement that treats a specific diagnosis, but
Right.
physiology doesn't work that way. The body doesn't separate itself into neat little boxes. Energy production affects every system simultaneously. So if cellular energy improves, it's reasonable to expect that multiple systems may function better because they're all drawing from that same energy pool. And that's why researchers are looking at creatine in neurological diseases, healthy aging, bone health, recovery from illness, depression, again, that metabolic health,
Right.
cardiovascular, and immune function. The common denominator isn't the disease itself. The common denominator is an energy issue.
I think that's actually a great bridge into the next section because if we're talking about organs that consume enormous amounts of energy, there's probably one organ that rises above all the rest, and that's the brain. When most people think about brain health, they may think brain puzzles, fish oil, maybe getting enough sleep, uh, probably all important. I don't think many people immediately think about creatine, though. But the research there is becoming really fascinating. Let's spend some time talking about why the brain may actually be one of the biggest reasons someone would consider creatine in the first place.
Yeah, and it really comes back to the same concept. We've been talking about this, and that's the whole concept of the energy, right? The brain is one of the most energy demanding organs in the entire body. Even though it's only accounts for about 2% of your body weight, it uses about 20% of your whole daily energy.
Wow, kind of a
So,
hog.
yeah, right. So let's think about that. Like a small organ consumes a fifth of your energy your body produces, and it's pretty
Wow.
crucial, right? Like
Yeah.
throughout your day, if
Yeah.
you notice if you got some brain fog going on. So every thought that you have requires energy. So when we think about energy, a lot of time we're thinking like the muscle expenditure or physical activity, but the mental load. If you have a mentally demanding job, even
Right.
though you're not physically, that is still using a lot of energy. So all your conversations, every time you learn something new, or even just listening to this podcast here, your
Right.
brain is using and producing ATP the whole time. It's never really gets a break. So even while you're sleeping, it's regulating your hormones, processing emotions. You still have to breathe. Like all
Sure,
these things
right?
are important. So all these things that keep us alive. So when we think about creatine's role in helping generate ATP, it actually makes sense that they're kind of researchers are connecting the dots, saying could this support the brain's energy production to improve how the brain functions? And like we said, creatine is really, really helpful, especially under stress.
Yeah, I really like that perspective because I think most of us have experienced mental exhaustion, but we don't usually think about it in terms of energy production. We'll say things like, my brain is fried, or I just can't think anymore, especially after a long workday or maybe making decisions all day. We tend to think that, that's just a physiological thing, but Really, what you're saying is that there may actually be a biological component to that. The brain is literally consuming enormous amounts of energy, and under certain circumstances, it may simply have a maybe a harder time keeping up with those demands.
Exactly. Yeah. Your mental work, it still has a lot of metabolic costs because the brain it's a physical organ and
Sure.
it's doing a job all day. So both physical and mental things require energy. So if you spend your whole day, seeing patients or teaching students or, all those things require a lot. Researchers
Preaching to
have
your congregation.
Yes,
All that.
absolutely. Research has discovered the brain actually regulates creatine different than your skeletal muscle, though. The blood-brain barrier is very selective about what allows into the brain, which is fantastic.
Sure.
So under normal conditions, simply taking more creatine doesn't necessarily flood the brain with creatine. Also, our muscles are very greedy. If you take creatine, they're soaking most of it up. So I think we'll get to dosing later on, but
Oh,
you have to
good.
take a sufficient amount or your muscles are just like stealing it all. But this is where the research has talked about either like higher dosing and like the benefits during times of metabolic stress. Metabolic stress, I think we've talked about, is really just a way of describing situations where your body just demands more energy, right?
Sure.
Beyond what's considered your normal. So it's like things that can contribute to that, like when you sleep only 4 to 5 hours, if you're traveling or if you're a parent, your kid has been sick all night, those things, the next day, you're still expected to do normal life, right? Function,
right?
show up to
Yeah.
work, drive safely, things like that. And so those are times where your brain didn't get the recovery time it normally depends on. So that's helpful to add. That creatine can be really helpful to kind of bridge that gap and like come to the rescue whenever the brain is
Sure.
under that stress, because it helps us to know how, it can just kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One study that really caught my attention involved sleep deprivation. I think we've all experienced how difficult it is to think clearly after a poor night's sleep. What did researchers actually find?
Yeah, so in the one that's regarding the sleep deprivation, they gave participants a relatively high dose of creatine. I think it was some participants had 20 grams, other participants had 40 grams.
Oh, that's a
So it's a big dose.
Yeah.
Before a period of prolonged sleep deprivation, what they found was that those individuals maintained better memory, better cognitive performance, and greater mental resilience compared to what we'd normally expect after significant sleep loss. And then I want to be careful with this because it doesn't mean creatine replaces sleep. So I know
Right.
a lot of people will follow like Tim Ferriss, who wrote the book, like the 4 Hour Work Week. And then
Oh, yeah.
he biohacked himself. I think he survived a full month on only 4 hours of sleep.
Oh, gosh.
'Cause
That
he
sounds terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's messing with God's design.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a whole nother
absolutely.
conversation. But, what he did, it was a fascinating study on one person, on himself. But
Sure.
yeah, so some people, I don't want you to hear this and say, okay, I'm going to keep getting not enough sleep, but then relying on creatine.
Max dose the creatine.
Yeah,
I mean, you're
yeah.
talking about 20 or 40 grams, but a typical dose is like 5 grams. And so I think for perspective, that's a significant increase. From
Yeah, and like Brittany said, we'll get into
Yeah.
the dosing. They do say, like, if you've had a period, greater than 30 days of poor sleep habits, your brain is in a physiologic stressed out state. And so when I first got onto the creatine, like, is this a hype? Is this going to stay?
Sure.
I follow Rhonda Patrick. She's an incredible researcher of all of this stuff, like in the
Nice.
functional world. She had a 3-hour podcast on creatine.
Oh, wow.
And because of the evidence that, she shared in there, they talk about doing 20 grams for 2 weeks for women, which is it's a high dose. And I absolutely hated the water retention.
Right.
But that's vanity. So that
Yeah.
revealed a little bit of sin nature in my
Sure.
world. But
we all do.
but my sleep metrics were undeniable
Huh.
on what that did, and the cognition and the focus. It was undeniable.
It's kind of that loading phase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to push through so you can get the brain retitrated because the skeletal muscle is so greedy.
It's also helpful, like biohacking, for like my husband works horrible hours. And so
Right.
there are some times when he's flipping his schedule from one day to the next where he can't get enough sleep because it will mess up the next.
Right.
So this is helpful for like if you have people in your life who are like, okay, there's short periods of time where this is not able to get the sleep that that you need to be able to function like a normal human the next day.
Right. So I love the distinction because I think that's something we've been trying to reinforce throughout the episode. Creatine isn't masking fatigue. It's not tricking your brain into feeling awake. It's supporting the underlying physiology that allows your cells to keep doing what they're designed to do, what they're supposed to be doing. I think one thing that's become really clear throughout today's conversation is that we've completely outgrown the idea of creatine being, just a gym supplement. We've talked about energy production, we've talked about muscles, we've talked about the brain, And I think if somebody's listening today who's never considered taking creatine because they only thought it was for, guys lifting weights, they're probably starting to realize this conversation is a lot bigger than that. One area that I've noticed getting a lot more attention recently is women's health. It feels like for years, creatine was almost exclusively marketed to men, but now I'm seeing physicians, physical therapists, and nutritionists talking specifically about creatine for women. So, Brittany, why has that conversation changed?
Yeah, I think, well, one, I think women are advocating a little bit better for
There you
themselves, and
go.
we're starting to
Good.
be a part of the conversation. We're just a little more complicated to do studies on. So, but
Sure.
if you look back like 20 or 30 years ago, most supplement research was performed on men because men are easy. Your cycle is the same. You don't have pregnancies that get in the way of things. But over the last decade, they've started to ask those broader questions that we've been talking about. So,
Hmm.
women have become a major focus of that. So, one thing that we learned and that women experience unique physiological changes throughout life that influence their muscle, their recovery, the metabolism, brain health, all that. For like estrogen is a big one. It's not just a reproductive hormone. When we have
Sure.
um, patients that come in that are like going through menopause, perimenopause, and we see those estrogen levels start to decrease, there's a major brain fog like component to that. So
Sure.
it's not just reproductive health. It helps muscle, bone, insulin sensitivity, inflammation, all those things. So when those levels begin to fluctuate, a lot of women notice like really frustrating changes that they can maybe feel weaker than they used to. Recovery takes longer. They're losing more muscle more easily. Your body composition changes.
Yep.
The brain fog, difficulty concentrating, and they're not just signs of getting older. They're signs that the body is changing, and it's one of those reasons that creatine has become a really good area, exciting area that research has started for women.
Yeah, I think that's encouraging because I know so many women who are doing all the right things. They're walking, they're exercising, they're eating healthier, at least than they've eaten before, and yet they feel like they're losing strength anyway. It can feel like they're working harder just to maintain where they are.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's very accurate.
Yeah.
I've heard that for many patients that they're just frustrated. They're like, I'm doing my best,
Right.
or they're doing way more than their husband, and like he's doing just
Right.
fine.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we have to remind women is that muscle isn't just about appearance, right? So
Right.
for decades, we talked about muscle as something like cosmetic, and I think that conversation has definitely shifted. But it's one of those most metabolically active tissues that you have in your body.
Hmm.
You need your muscle to support your blood sugar regulation, insulin sensitivity, increases your metabolic flexibility, balance, and mobility. We talk about as we age, right? Protecting
Right.
our joints, helping to maintain bone health. It's a major conversation in the bone health, especially for women, osteoporosis.
Sure.
Helps basically it's preserving your independence as you age. So we don't need to be talk about it for vanity's sake. It's okay to have muscle and to look good, but
Right.
like we want to live good, right?
Yes,
So we
indeed.
got to encourage women to shift their mindset to from being smaller and like trying to take up less space to like how can I make them stronger? Strength is protective, muscle is protective.
Yes.
Creatine is one of those tools that can help support these goals when we combine it with resistance training, protein. It's not like we said, can't just take creatine and solve all your problems, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Right.
I wish, but no.
Yeah. But the creatine doesn't replace that exercise though. So if you take creatine and then you're not putting your muscles through that stress, it's not going to utilize it. You're not just going to build muscle just taking
Right.
the creatine. So a lot of people, everyone's looking for that easy fix. That's why a lot of people will unfortunately turn to medication because it's easier and simpler to
Sure.
take. So this is not, just a creatine that's going to do the things for you, but creatine amplifies the benefits of your good habits. So they're going to make that working out worth it a little bit more. If you're
Right.
strengthening, it'll help you recover better. May allow you to perform, more reps, like I talked about earlier, over weeks. That's going to add up. It's might not notice it right away, but over months, years, that's really good improvement in strength in your lean body mass, and especially meaningful for women who are struggling to keep that muscle as they're entering that midlife, because preserving that muscle just becomes so important for longevity.
Sure. I love that statement. Creatine amplifies the benefits of good habits. Um, Creating good habits,
Mhm.
that's a more important process. And then adding something like creatine on the next level. Now, one thing that stood out to me while reading some of the research was that creatine isn't only being studied for muscles in women. Researchers are also looking at cognitive health, mood, overall quality of life during menopause. That seems like a pretty significant shift from where this conversation started a few years ago.
It really is. So we're recognizing that menopause isn't simply reproductive transition, right? It's a whole body transition. So when your estrogen declines, they experience those changes in the energy, your sleep. Sleep is such a big one. You have so many
Yeah.
patients that come in, they're like, I just can't sleep. And you're like, again, that you have all those consequences of not being able to sleep, and your brain's not having the energy. So your mood, your cognition, it affects your body comp. So it's not a magic solution, but because it supports that cellular energy production at like the foundational level, it can help all those other areas as
Right.
well. So it's exciting because it gives women another tool alongside the nutrition, the resistance training, stress management, good sleep as much as you can.
Right.
So none of these work, in isolation. We got to work it all together.
Yeah, teamwork makes the dream work, right? I love it because one of the themes we've been coming back to throughout the episode here is that health is rarely about one miracle supplement. It's about creating an environment where the body has what it needs to function well. And then, speaking of that, I think there's another idea where muscle plays a much bigger role than people realize, and that's in our bones. Because I think most people assume creatine has nothing to do with bone health, but that's actually not what the research is showing, right, Dr. Callahan?
Yeah, so when people think about bone health, they usually think about calcium or vitamin D,
Right.
and those nutrients are certainly important for proper bone health, but bones don't exist in isolation. They're constantly communicating with the muscles. So in fact, every time a muscle contracts, it places a mechanical stress on the bone. Too much muscle contraction can lead to like a stress fracture. It weakens
wow.
the bone. And how like stress fractures happen, I like to really use it. It can be honestly sometimes a malnourishment. So I use the car analogy a lot. If we were to get in our car today and drive to Washington D.C. for America's birthday party
There you go.
coming up on July 4th, we would have to stop and fill up that car multiple times along the route.
Right.
Depending on what car, there's a very specific gas. Is it diesel? Is it premium or
Sure.
E88? We would have to put that in. But if we put in a different fuel source like water or canola oil in our car would completely
Stop in the tracks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But because our body is always responding to good stressors, chronic stressors, how well we're sleeping, again, there's all of this interconnection with it. And so stress fractures happen or bone weakenings happen because we're not fueling. Either we're not fueling with the right foundation from a food standpoint or because of that overtraining issue. So muscle contraction, though, and good healthy muscle contraction is really, really good for strengthening the bone. So the stress tells specialized bone cells called osteoblasts that bone needs to remain strong. And it's really, again, a use it or lose it system.
Sure.
So that's why we encourage men and women to invest in even weighted vest. Even if you sit at a desk all day, having that skeletal muscle
I
strain
keep seeing
on
those
your
ads.
body.
I need to get one of those.
Yeah, and I think it's good and it's important for people to have. I feel like I observe that conventional healthcare will say, as you age, you're going to lose bone density. As you age, you're going to have age-related muscle
Sure.
loss. They're not wrong. That can
Right.
happen, but then when we surrender to bone loss is going to happen and surrender to we're going to lose muscle, that makes us metabolically weaker to fight all diseases, and our quality of life is completely reciprocal to that as
Yeah.
a result. And so the stronger and the healthier our muscles are, the better communication with our bones. That's why resistance training and again, some of that weighted vest work can be so profound, not only for the muscles, but also as the bone.
So creatine isn't necessarily building bone directly the way people might think of calcium or vitamin D. It's supporting the system that helps bones stay healthy.
Correct. Creatine isn't that replacement for exercise. It's that tiny tool that if someone
Sorry,
exercises. Yeah. But what we see too, especially like in our healthy aging population, some patients, they'll say, well, I don't want to work out. I've got arthritis in my knees
Yep.
or it creates back pain. Some of that is because your muscles are so depleted in creatine in itself that creatine actually
Right.
can help with that muscle soreness in the
Wow.
first place. So by improving our strength, our power and our recovery, people are often able to place greater, healthier stress on those bones during resistance training. So then we're increasing bone density, we're increasing that amount of skeletal muscle mass that we have. Some research also suggests creatine may reduce bone resorption, which is a process of breaking down bone tissue. In other words, it may help preserve bone while improving muscular system that it's supporting. Researchers are looking whether creatine influences osteoblast activity directly as the cells responsible for building new bone. And we still need more long-term research on this. But when we have women come in that want to talk about their bone health, creatine is one of those non-negotiables that we do want them to do strength training, but in order to preserve that skeletal muscle mass that they have and not surrender to that age-related muscle
Sure.
decline, creatine is one of the best things. And the great thing is that we can test that monthly
Right.
and make sure that it's working. And we've had patients jump on it, and within the first 30 days, they're up 3 pounds of skeletal muscle mass.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
impressive.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those reasons we have to stop thinking about muscle and bone as two separate, especially in aging women. I have someone I know who just got diagnosed as osteoporosis, and they're like, okay, what do I all need to take? I'm like, you need to move your body. Like, we're going to have you stomp around your house. Your bones, that feedback of that, it literally will take that and know, like, I need to be stronger because the demand is there.
Sure.
You're someone who hasn't, used a lot of, you're not jumping, you're not running, those types of things. That's one of the easiest things you can start to do. But when someone loses that muscle, they often become less active. So when they become less active, your bones really receive less of that stimulation, your balance declines, then your fall risk increases, and suddenly the fractures become more likely. And we've talked about the fractures and the likelihood of like recovery. So preserving that muscle isn't just about strength, it's about protecting your entire musculoskeletal system and your just longevity.
That really changes how we think about healthy aging, or at least it should. Instead of asking, how do I prevent osteoporosis? Maybe a better question is, how do I preserve muscle, movement, and strength for the next 30 years? Because all those things seem to be working together.
Yeah, one of the strongest predictors of healthy aging isn't simply just living longer. So there's a phrase, we have lifespan and then health span. And so lifespan is from birth to death, but health span is from birth to the timeline in our lifespan in which our health rapidly declines. So maintaining the ability to keep doing things that matter to you. So getting on and off the floor without assistance. Now, some of our listeners might be saying, I already can't do that.
Right.
For a lot of people, just because you can't do it now, that's your current baseline, doesn't mean that we can't get you there with proper mobility, work, and safety. But carrying groceries, traveling, playing with grandchildren, working in the garden, walking without fear of falling. Those aren't glamorous health goals, but they're incredibly meaningful.
Right.
And that's why we're talking when we discuss health span, not just adding the years to the life, but preserving the strength, mobility, cognition, and independence that to actually enjoy those years.
Right. So we've talked about energy production, the brain, muscle, women, bone health. And hopefully by now it's becoming clear that creatine isn't simply a performance supplement. It's really becoming a conversation about resilience, helping the body meet the demands that we place on it every single day. But there are still a lot of questions that people have. I think this is probably the section a lot of people have been waiting for, because if we're being honest, creatine has probably accumulated more myths than almost any supplement I can think of. If somebody searches creatine online, they immediately find themselves digging through questions like, does it damage your kidneys? Will it make me lose my hair? Do I have to cycle it? Is it safe? There are all kinds of concerns that people have asked repeatedly for years. So let's just work through some of the biggest ones together and talk about the research and what it actually says. Let's start with the problem, I think maybe the biggest myth of all. Does creatine damage your kidneys?
Sure. And I think it's such a good question. But the good news is that in healthy individuals, the current body of evidence simply doesn't support the idea that creatine damages the kidneys. Part of the confusion comes from the lab marker, which this is something our office runs and everybody, is creatinine. So creatinine, not creatine, but creatinine is a normal breakdown product of the creatine metabolism. If someone begins supplementing with creatine, that's expected that their blood creatinine level may rise slightly. Excuse me.
No.
The creatinine level may rise slightly because there's simply more creatine being metabolized. The important part is that increase in creatinine is not the same thing as a kidney injury.
Interesting.
Researchers have studied creatinine and creatinine in healthy individuals for decades, and repeated studies have not demonstrated kidney damage for recommended doses of creatine monohydrate. It's different from somebody who already has significant kidney disease. In that situation, we always recommend talking with your healthcare provider because each individual medical situation has possibly a need for individualized recommendations.
Sure.
But otherwise, for healthy adults, creatine has constantly demonstrated an excellent safety profile.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful explanation, because I can see how somebody would look at a lab report and see creatinine, or I'm not going to get it anyway. You see that goes up a little and then immediately assumes, well, something bad has happened. But what you're saying is that we have to understand what that number actually represents.
Yeah, lab values need more context. And to kidney function, anybody who has a GFR, so kidney filtration rate, when we look at those, we can look at all these biomarkers if somebody does have concerns before they go on any supplementation. But creatinine is just one piece of the puzzle.
So next myth, hair loss.
Yeah, so this comes out entirely from one small rugby study published many years ago. What's interesting is that the study never actually measured hair loss. It didn't count hairs. It didn't examine hair follicles. It measured changes in a hormone called DHT. And then people made the assumption that the increased DHT would automatically lead to hair loss. Since then, multiple reviews have looked at the available evidence, and we simply don't have the convincing data that it shows baldness. So while it's a common concern, the current evidence doesn't support creatinine as actual cause of hair loss.
Yeah, so another one, people will often say, I don't want to take creatine because I don't want to look bloated. What actually is happening there?
Yeah, so I can personally attest to this. This can happen,
Yeah.
especially at high doses, like 20 grams a day. But creatine does increase water inside the muscle cells, but that's actually one of the ways it supports muscle function. We're talking about intracellular water, and that means water inside the cell, not fluid accumulation under the skin. So many people actually notice that their muscles look fuller and feel better or better hydrated, and that's a very different from saying creatine causes unhealthy bloating or fat gain.
So is that hydrating you?
Yeah. So on the InBody, we can actually see and measure intracellular water versus extracellular water, and you want a healthy balance. And I popped on when I was in the middle of my 2-week loading dose, and you could tell I had a lot more intracellular water. But I also could tell at the gym, like I was supposed to have a PR week, and I blew it like out of the water way higher because I think my cells were just so much more hydrated. And then again, my sleep metrics were so much better for, when you have a PR day at the gym, you're going to need a day or two. If it's a really good day or you're really lifting heavy, you need a day or two of recovery.
Yeah.
And it was incredible to see how fast how I recovered compared to the month before when it was supposed to be a big day.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So that this whole conversation with women, because I think this comes up a lot of like the water retention. So knowing that your scale may change a little bit, but if you come in, you can do an InBody in the office and see that you're not getting fat. It's
I
just
love
the
that
water.
InBody machine.
It's
by
so
the way.
powerful.
I really do love standing on that thing. It tells a story that is hard to hear or learn otherwise. If you've never stood on an InBody, I'd encourage you to hold these ladies and stop in the office there. It is fascinating. So what about dehydration? I've heard a lot of athletes, say they avoid creatine in the summer because they're worried that it's going to make them cramp.
Yeah, so the research actually shows and points the opposite direction. Because that creatine pulls water into the muscle cells, it may actually improve the hydration status. Other studies have shown that there's no increase in cramping or dehydration, and some of the research even suggests that creatine users may tolerate heat and exercise much better because of the intracellular hydration and because of the cellular metabolism. When you have that ATP, when you have so much more cellular energy, usually you will see better, again, efficiency as a whole.
So here's another question. Do you have to cycle it? Do you have to cycle creatine? I've heard people say that you should take it for a few months, stop for a while, and start again. What's the deal with that?
So I think it depends on what are you currently cycling for your workout routine, what's your sleep routine.
Sure.
I think for some people, if they're getting ready for a big bodybuilding competition, sure, their degree of cycling. And then if they're going to take a season off or, recover for a month, we have several of our patients are Ironman triathletes.
Oh, cool.
And so, depending on what their training loads or basically what is their metabolic demand would change whether I would recommend them cycling it or not. But the current evidence doesn't support that in practice. Your body uses creatine every day. So if your goal is to maintain healthy tissue stores, then consistency is much more important than cycling. And I use cycling more of like, well, what should we put your dose at? And again, it's looking at other biomarkers.
Sure.
How is your current stress? If you have a wearable, what is going on with your sleep? So again, I like to individualize that, but in clinic, there's no evidence that suggests globally that your body somehow becomes dependent on creatine or stops making its own because you're supplementing normal physiologic amounts. Daily intake is generally what's recommended. When I talk to people about that 2-week loading dose of where you're doing 20 grams, that might be considered a cycle, but I would only do that for, the first 2 weeks and then lower to that normal 5 to 10 grams a day.
Yeah, that was kind of the next question. That loading phase. I mean, for so many years, it seemed like everybody was taking 20 grams a day for a week and then dropping down.
Sure.
So is that the common protocol, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so loading simply saturates muscle stores more quickly, but it's not required. For most people, taking 5 grams of creatine monohydrate every day will gradually achieve the same level of saturation over weeks. If someone doesn't want to load, they're not missing out. It just is going to require more time to get them titrated.
So, one thing that surprised me while reading through some of the research was that several experts actually take more than 5 grams a day themselves. Maybe you could explain why.
Yeah, so the standard recommendation is that 5 grams is excellent for most healthy adults, and it's been kind of the dose that's been used in a lot of studies. However, they're starting to look at all those other benefits we talked about. The muscle is really greedy. So if we want the cognitive benefits of it, we do need to a lot of times see a higher dose because the different tissues require different amounts. So some bone studies have showed that you need closer to 8 to 10 grams daily to get that benefit. The brain health, we talked about the sleep deprivation. You need significantly higher short-term doses, like that 20 plus grams or even up to 40 for like acute situations. That's based on weight as well. So like, a big muscly man is going to need more than, us.
Sure.
So those higher doses are being studied in very specific contexts, and they're not meant for everyday recommendations. But a lot of the researchers that we've talked about take probably 10 grams a day as their baseline. So that is over the typical 5, but that's for, like I said, those cognitive benefits, the bone health, those things like that. They're just because they're thinking beyond the muscle. For the average person, we don't need to overcomplicate it. If you start with 5 grams a day consistently, you're doing great. That's going to be a really good solid base to start with. Also, some people will notice like you definitely take it with food. If you've never taken it, like you can kind of slowly go into it. It depends on the person. I'm someone who I tend, unfortunately, if I take supplements and don't have enough food, I get nauseous. So if it's not a problem for you, that's great. But starting with 5, if you handle that well and you do want to do the loading phase, then you can up it. But it might not be a good idea to just start with the 5.
Now, do you have to take that? Well, say you wanted to do 10. Could you do 5 in the morning and 5 later on in the day?
Ideally, you would split it apart. They say that you could start with the 5 and the 5, and then you can go.
That's what I'm doing. So I was hoping you were going to say it's okay.
Yeah, that would be ideal.
Excellent. So I think we've reached the point in today's conversation where people listening are probably pulling out their phones and thinking, all right, I'm interested. Where do I buy it? You can walk into a supplement store. You can search online. Suddenly, you're looking at creatine monohydrate, hydrochloride, buffered creatines, nitrates, the gummies, capsules, powders, pre-workout blends. It goes on and on. Let's simplify this for the folks. If somebody's listening, has never taken creatine before, and they're wondering, where do I start? Dr. Calla, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so the overwhelming majority of research we've discussed, whether it's for muscle, brain, healthy aging, bone health, recovery, or exercise, it's using the single form of creatine monohydrate. It's the form that has been studied the longest. It's consistently shown to be safe, it's effective, and it's fairly inexpensive. And despite newer forms that continue to appear on the market, none have consistently demonstrated the superior results globally compared to just plain creatine monohydrate. We like it in powder form. So we have, with Elevate Nutraceuticals, we have just plain creatine monohydrate. It does come in powder form. 1 scoop is the 5 grams a day. So from a simplicity, and I like it because we can even give it to kids. And believe it or not, I think there's benefit, especially in the adolescence and going through puberty stages, just because their brain is soaking up all those hormones.
Right.
And what better way to give it, especially if they're in activities or potentially have any sort of sleep deprivation or even learning disabilities.
In a powder like that, can you mix it in like yogurt or something?
Yeah, so you can mix it with your yogurt. I tell people, because a lot of people actually need electrolytes to put it in with their electrolyte beverage to get it in. People can put it in their coffee. I have not found any studies. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. But someone's like, well, what if I put it in my coffee? Is it going to denature it? To my knowledge,
they say it just has to be it needs to be a ton of caffeine. So your typical coffee at home where you're having like 100 milligrams, not a problem. When I was researching this, it's got to be like 300-400 milligrams of caffeine to make a difference.
With an energy drink.
Right.
Yeah, so definitely not that. But if you're doing your normal coffee at home, it should not be an issue.
Okay.
Yeah, some of like the pre-workouts, like I'll, stop by the some of the stores and I'll just pick it up to see what's in there. And they'll put creatine with carnitine, or creatine with, what's the other one? Oh, with a ton of caffeine. And sometimes I'm like, this doesn't seem like this would be a good idea, but I'm not sure why, but makes them feel jacked at the time they're taking it.
Right. Yeah. You just never know, do you?
Yeah.
I actually find all of this refreshing because it seems like every supplement conversation ends with somebody saying, well, you need the premium version that costs 3 times as much as that normal one over there. This almost sounds like the opposite. The simplest option is also the one with the best evidence.
Yeah, creatine monohydrate has stood the test of time.
Hmm.
A lot of the things that I've seen, microionized creatine, monohydrate, which simply means the particles have been made smaller. It doesn't necessarily make it more effective, but people find it mixes into liquids a little easier and much gentler on the stomach. When it comes to supplement and supplement manufacturers, I would just prefer patients that the creatine monohydrate is manufactured as a raw material producer in the United States. A lot of these supplement companies that are finding on our shelves are being sent from other countries. And when we study them, because it's not regulated by the FDA, we're seeing a lot of creatine monohydrate, especially in the gummies and the powders. If it's not made in the United States, actually has been like laced with lead.
Right. Actually, there's a ton of evidence that the gummies are a terrible idea for all kinds of
Yeah.
reasons, let alone all the extra sugar that you don't need. Um, so I would concur wholeheartedly. The simplest answer is the best answer. So beyond looking for creatine monohydrate, what else should people be paying attention to? Because even if two products both say creatine monohydrate on the label, I'm guessing they're probably not all manufactured the same way.
Yeah, so the ingredient itself may be the same, but the quality control can vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. So I like it as a standalone. I don't like it necessarily added with anything else. Whenever possible, I encourage people to look for companies that perform independent third-party
Yep.
testing. These organizations verify that the product actually contains what's listed on the label, but also what's the dose, which is a big thing. And then you want to make sure that it's not, that it's tested for contaminants like heavy metals or impurities. You'll see certifications like NSF certified for sport or informed sport. Those certifications don't necessarily make the creatine work any better, but they do provide another level of confidence, especially for like our student athletes, that they want to make sure that they're not taking anything that might get them banned, like if at the college level. The supplement industry isn't regulated the same way the prescription medications are, which means quality and transparency can become a little bit more important for us to be mindful of. Two products that may look identical sitting on the store shelf, but one company may invest heavily in purity testing while another one doesn't, or goes to the lowest sourcing. So again, that's where when you look at a supplement, there's no guarantee that the dose is what the supplement manufacturer put on that label.
Right. So looking at a fancy label isn't the only thing to look at.
Right.
Sometimes a very simple label might be the better choice, but
Yeah.
do your homework ultimately. One trend I've noticed lately is those creatine gummies. It sounds like every supplement eventually becomes a gummy. I don't know why that is. Is that a good option? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's good marketing, and
Yeah.
I got to hand it to them. But the challenge is that the creatine gummies don't actually contain the amount of creatine that's
Right.
been studied. I've sometimes just done a price comparison when patients will bring it in. I'll ask them like, "How much did you spend on this?" They say, "Oh, it was just $35, but it was auto shipped." But I'm like, "Well, I need you to take 20 of these gummies
Right.
per day,
Oh,
which then is
gosh.
also going to give you X amount of sugar or
Right.
food dyes." But the research really is around that sweet spot of the 5 grams, but each gummy only contains either half a gram or, like I said, you have to eat so many. It also means consuming more sugar, sweeteners, flavoring, additional ingredients that aren't really necessary. I tell people if you really want it in it like a gummy, maybe do Jell-O, like
Right.
make it on
Make
your own in
That's
Jell-O.
a cool idea.
Yeah. For most people, plain creatine powder is simply the most practical and economic option.
And the powder is really just not that hard to use. Like you just
Right.
can mix it into pretty much anything. People will have questions about the timing of taking it. Like, if you're, people will couple protein at certain times for their workouts, whether they take it at a certain time of day. But really, it's the consistency that matters more than anything. So just add it to an existing habit. Like Kala said, add it to your electrolytes or with your breakfast or anything like that.
Yeah.
Just being consistent is the most important part.
I love it. So, because we've come back to this idea several times today, health isn't usually built on one perfect decision. It's built on small habits that become part of your daily routine. So, instead of worrying about whether you took creatine at exactly the right minute after your workout, it's probably more important to simply ask, am I taking it consistently, right?
Yeah, exactly. Creatine isn't like caffeine where you take it and immediately feel something happening. It's working by gradually increasing your body's creatine stores over time. Think of it almost like filling a reservoir. Each day you're adding a little more until those tissues become saturated. That's why consistency is so much more than perfect timing. They've even, revealed that the studies, especially if somebody's wanting to get jacked at the gym,
Right.
they're like, should I take it before the workout, during the workout, after? They have shown that it actually does not matter as long as you're taking it on a daily basis. You will get the gains from it. For most people, the best time to take creatine is the time they'll actually remember to take it.
There it is. So, I think one of the biggest takeaways from today's conversation is just how much the story around creatine has changed. For years, it was marketed almost exclusively to athletes and to bodybuilders. But as the research has grown, we've realized it's so much more than that. Creatine is really about supporting one of the most fundamental processes in the body, and that's energy production. Today, we've talked about how it supports muscles, yes, but also the brain, healthy aging, bone health, women's health, recovery, and overall resilience. And through all of it, one message has remained remarkably simple. You don't need the newest or trendiest product. A quality creatine monohydrate taken consistently alongside strength training, good nutrition, and healthy lifestyle habits can be a simple but powerful investment in your long-term health. I also hope today's conversation reminded you that lasting health usually isn't built on flashy interventions. More often, it's built on doing the simple things well, day after day. Those small choices may not seem dramatic in the moment, but over months and even years, they compound into something incredibly meaningful. But as we've said several times throughout this episode, energy is only half the equation. Creatine helps provide the energy your body needs to perform, to recover, and to adapt. But energy alone can't build muscle, repair tissues, make hormones, produce neurotransmitters, or support a healthy immune system. For that, your body needs raw materials. And that's exactly where we're headed next week. We're going to dedicate an entire episode to protein, not as a bodybuilding nutrient per se, but as one of the most foundational nutrients for human health. We're going to talk about why protein is involved in virtually every system of the body, how much you actually need at different stages of life, why so many adults, women, and even kids aren't getting enough, how protein supports hormones, brain health, blood sugar, pregnancy, recovery, and healthy aging, and how to realistically hit your protein goals without feeling like you're eating grilled chicken every few hours. Nobody wants to do that. If today's episode was about how the body creates energy, next week's episode is about what the body is actually built from. We hope you're going to join us for that conversation as well. Thanks so much for spending part of your day with us. We really do appreciate that. If you found today's episode helpful, we really would love for you to share it with your friend or your family members. Until next time, keep investing in the foundations. Take care of the body that God has entrusted you with. And we're going to see you next week on this Whole Health Podcast. God bless you guys.
Thanks for joining us today on Whole Health. If you'd like to learn more about our program, have a question for our hosts, or want to find past episodes, just head to wholehealthlive.com.